Langenhoe Hauntings, Jensen Romer. So, for those of you who don't know where Essex is, this is East Anglia, and down here is Essex. And if you were to go straight south from Bury St Edmunds, which I'm sure most of you know is a wonderful and important city, you will find yourself down on the Essex coastline. Now, Essex is very much a county of two halves. Large parts of it, down by Chelmsford and Southend, are actually rather Londonified, if you see what I mean by that. They look to the capital. And then there's a kind of rural periphery, which is almost completely isolated from the modernity. And it's along this stretch here that you've got large farming dynasties, small villages, and yet wonderful large houses owned by people who commute up from London. Okay. Now, where is Langenhoe? Our first question. Well, Langenhoe is clearly directly below Fingering-Hoe. Now, for some reason, whenever I say Fingering-Hoe, Americans laugh at me, and I still don't really understand why, but never mind. Let's just assume that I'm very naive. Across the water is Wivenhoe, where I believe we've got members in Wivenhoe, and Abberton and Peldon are over here. If you were to pass straight up, you'd come to Colchester, and some of the staff of Colchester University, who I know still live today around Wivenhoe, Fingering-Hoe, etc. To the south of Langenhoe, the village, there was an Essex salt marsh, and beyond that, there's a causeway that leads across to Mersey Island. And Mersey Island is renowned for, of course, its Roman Centaurian hauntings, which some of you will know about. And the salt marshes themselves were said in the distant past to be haunted by all manner of strange creature and by weird lights that led travellers astray. Now, the contemporary understanding by the 18th and 19th century was that these were actually just criminal smuggling gangs who were coming up the Thames Estuary or up a bit above the Thames Estuary on the Essex coast and were putting in and landing goods around here. If we go to the next slide, it's doing whistle. Never mind. That is an Essex salt marsh. It's a rather grainy, misty photo, but I felt it gives you the feeling of the bleakness of an actual salt marsh. Now, the marshes between Mersey and Ed's trying to get in here. The marshes between Mersey Island and Fingering-Hoe around Langenhoe have largely now been drained, and it's prime agricultural farmland. And there's a housing estate as well, you'll see in a moment. But at the time when it was, we're talking about, the marshes were still there. Now, nowadays, the town of Langenhoe is served by this church, which is St Andrew's. There's also, I believe this one is now a Methodist, but there's also another little church. Oh, no, sorry, this is the Church of England one. There's a Methodist tin hut there, as I recall, a tin tabernacle style church, but it's been a number of years since I was last there. St Andrew's is a rather lovely, quaint little red brick building, but it's certainly no medieval charmer, is it? As British churches go, you wouldn't want to go champing there. And yet that rural scene, that rural idyll, was once the site of a major trauma. In 1884, on the morning of April the 22nd, things seemed pretty normal in Essex. People were going out their business, the shopkeepers were open. Colchester, Lion Yard Colchester, was filled with people. All across southern Essex, things seemed to go on as they had for centuries. It was an era of kind of optimism, actually, an era of prosperity. Can somebody else let Edwards in? Thank you. He keeps coming and going. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, suddenly, however, on that morning, something terrible happened. The ground began to shake violently. And as it did, cracks appeared in a number of medieval buildings. And then people said the ground felt as if it lifted itself up and dropped. Everything shook and no one knew what was going on, though many people, it said, immediately fell on their knees and began to pray, convinced it was the end. Even the most irreligious. Some people in the pub complained their beer was spilt. Other people ran outside, and across Colchester, people suddenly came to the realization within a few minutes that they had suffered an earthquake. Now, this took a while to sink in because the immediate response, and here's Abberton and Langenhoe today, that's one parish now, and you can see an aerial photo of the two combined parishes, Langenhoe being a bit down here, Abberton being up here with the new housing estates. On the left, there is the first week of May's graphic, an illustrated weekly newspaper, where you can see damage from the earthquake. But the response in London was, earthquakes don't happen. Now, as it happens, there had been a North African earthquake, I believe it's in Ethiopia, so West African earthquake, East African earthquake, earlier in the month, and there had been a major public subscription raised to assist people. But very few people reached deep into their pockets for an earthquake in Essex. In fact, most people in London found the notion that Essex had been struck by an earthquake utterly ridiculous. But it actually did cause a few casualties. The number of fatalities we still don't really know, and it was probably in single figures, perhaps just in double figures, 12, 13. Most people were struck by falling debris or succumbed to heart attacks or drowned. But nonetheless, nowadays when we feel an earthquake in England, they tend to be rather puny, pathetic little things, don't they? But the 1884 earthquake, as you can see here, was enough to bring down the roof on a pub. It was enough to smash up buildings and churches. And at Langenhoe, the medieval church was absolutely wrecked. I don't know what you think of that, but I would say that looks pretty damaged. And the church commissioners, somewhat grudgingly, decided that they would repair it because it was, unlike some of the other churches affected in the earthquake, it was possible to do something about it. Langenhoe was relatively close to the epicenter of the earthquake. It was quite a major earthquake. I can't remember what it reached. Was it only 5 or something like that? 5.5? It wasn't a major earthquake in global terms, but it was certainly the strongest earthquake that anybody has experienced in England for a long time. There was a 7, I think, in 1931 off the coast of Norfolk, somewhere out beyond King's Lynn. No, further over it must be. Out beyond Caister, that kind of direction. But we can look that up later. Anyway, this is Langenhoe Church, and April the 22nd, 1884, it was thoroughly smashed up, ironically, by act of God, as the insurers would have said. This was the inside of the building, and there's something, I've always found something rather eerie about these pictures, especially the one on the right. I don't know why I find it eerie, but I just do. Maybe that's just maybe it's just because I'm so used to going into East Anglian churches and I'm far from used to seeing them in this kind of condition. I don't think these subtitles are going to be useful for anyone at all unless they're very imaginative, but never mind, at least they might cause a few laughs, so I'll leave them on. Right, moving on. So, the unexplained 45. Why is that on top of my picture of... Well, it appears later in the story, but there's a rather nice picture underneath that of the church. Now, I can't find a picture, a plan of Langenhoe Church. So instead, I'm going to show you a picture of the neighbouring parish of Fingeringhoe. And while we're lingering on Fingeringhoe, we can just quickly glance at the parts of the church so I can talk about what they are. When you go to church, it's likely that you will enter through a porch or possibly through the tower gate, through the main doors. But the bit which will interest you is the nave, because that's where the seats are. And then the choir or chancel is here. This is an area at the very front, which is used by the choir, usually in a church, though it can be used for all kinds of purposes. And then at the far end of the building, facing east, because you nearly always build churches to face east. I'll mention something else about that in a moment. There is an altar, and the altar area is often in very old churches either screened off by what's called a rood screen, R-O-O-D, not R-U-D-E. It doesn't have strange, naughty pictures on it. And around here is the altar rail where you take communion. So you sit here facing this way, and at the west end, you have the tower. And on this one, you'll see that there's a spiral staircase here with stairs going up. Now, I believe, but I could be wrong, that this was very similar to the floor plan of Langenhoe, except Langenhoe didn't have the south aisle and the south chapel. Finally, you've got the vestry. The vestry is backstage at a church. It's where the vicar or the rector changes into their robes. Now, before we get too technical, the rector is simply somebody who owns the living, so they have the right to appoint a minister. If the rector is the incumbent, if the person who owns the right to decide who has that job is themselves the clergyman, they are called the rector, usually, I believe. If they hire somebody else to run the church for them, then that person stands vicariously to them, and they are called a vicar. Only people who are very pedantic would care, but this is ASSAP, so I thought I would try and get it right. And in fact, the gentleman we're going to be talking about in a moment was the rector of Langenhoe. This is inside Langenhoe Church. That's a photo by, I believe, Peter Underwood. You'll find it on the Spooky Isles, and it's a rather nice photo which shows you the east end of the church. You'll see the lamps down here, which provided lighting. The vestry door's hidden in the chancel area up there. And finally, for setting up purposes, here is the church. There are cottages here, and we know the names and the identities of the people who lived in the cottages throughout the period in question. They get involved in the story several times. And over here is the farm. Now, just beyond this, there's an area which is, so that's east, that's west. So just beyond where, towards us, you would be hitting the marshes, which were by this time being reclaimed. But this farm is close to the sea, effectively. And the farm, which has gone by various names, is normally been known as Langenhoe Hall. It's a lovely building. It's been rebuilt a number of times, and in this form, it looks like it's a Regency structure, very much so. But whether that's the case or not, I would have to look. I'm sure that there was an older hall on the site before. Across from the hall, 2 farm workers' cottages, the church, and then nothing. Just empty fields for a really long way. You can walk a couple of miles up into the village itself in the 40s. Okay, so Hall, which was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Cutter, who were farmers. They had the right to farm the land. 2 cottages with agricultural labourers who'd lived there since 1913 and 1940, respectively, and the church. The vicarage is also of import, but it's further down the road off to the right. So, okay, let's move on. This story comes up from time to time in the Fortean Times, and if you've got these episodes, if you've got either of these articles, it's worth looking at either of these issues. There's another issue which I couldn't find, but which has this picture in it. And what it was that one of the Fortean writers was making their way around looking at parish journals, the registers kept in churches from the 1560s onwards by law, and in some churches before that, which are often filled with Fortean and strange phenomena. Comparatively, vicars wrote down strange things that happened. And where would they write them? Very often in the register. So if there's a plague in a parish or a murder or something of significance, the vicar would often record it in the register. In between them is something they found tucked in to the parish register when they were looking, which is the Reverend Merryweather. Now, the Reverend Merryweather is a really important fellow in our narrative. and he had moved to Langenhoe from his former parish in the north of England. He had been a vicar for a long time, and he was described as a massive, stout man, muscular, powerful, and taking no prisoners by one person. That was when he said that he did not suffer fools, but he was a strong-willed fellow, and he was again, the word you get is a kind of hefty, solid fellow, completely unimaginative and very northern. And there's various other descriptions of him from the people who knew him over the years. He seems to have been very well liked, though. I mean, I don't think anybody at all had a bad word to say about him that I've read over the researches for this. And he one day, let's go back a couple, he arrived from his parish and he's down here at the vicarage, and he decided that he was going to go and visit Langenhoe Hall and pay his respects. Now, one of the reasons he might have done that was that during the 19th century, Langenhoe had been severely depleted as a parish. Nearly everyone had gone off to either the Methodist chapel or the Baptist chapel, or had gone up to Abbotsbury Church, which is much closer, to the village. Why would you go down to the old church in the middle of on the edge of the marsh, when you could go to one of the free places of worship within a 3-mile walk of your house to the north, or even go up to Fingering-Hoe or across to Wivenhoe? So why would you do it? You wouldn't. But some people did. But his congregation, when he arrived, was around 6 people. And the church commissioners, you can see why they hesitated to spend so much money repairing the church for 6 people. I mean, I've been to a lot of churches like that in my life, but sadly, it's not really, at the end of the day, financially possible to keep the churches open. So he went to see Mr. and Mrs. Cutting. Mr. Cutting was away, I believe, Cutter, and I believe he was away in London on business on the day when he first arrived. He was shown around the house by his wife. And while he was being shown around the house and he was admiring it, he went into a bedroom that had rather wonderful views over the marshes. And the wife, the lady of the manor, so to speak, said, "I've never liked this room. Me and my husband don't use it, even though it's the largest room. We're not keen on it." And without further ado, she walked off down the corridor, waiting for him to leave, or waiting for him to follow, rather. Well, at that point, he turned round and he took another look out of the window. And while he was admiring the view, he said he felt no feelings one way or the other. But he turned and began to walk across the room after her, when suddenly he encountered a ghost. Now, he's in somebody else's house, following the lady of the house around, being shown the, structure that's been rebuilt at least 3 times in its history. Goes back to the Middle Ages, we believe, but this building is comparatively modern. And as he walks across the room, he suddenly feels the embrace of a naked woman. This is a problem for a Church of England vicar. I mean, sure, Church of England vicars can have wives. He lived with his housekeeper and her daughter. He could have, if he wanted to, married anyone in the parish. Possibly not, the lady of the manor, as she was already married. But there is no reason whatsoever for him not to feel the embrace of a naked lady, at least within the bounds of holy wedlock. But when it occurs to you, when you're effectively a guest in somebody else's house, it must be discomforting. As he stood there, he didn't really know how to react. He felt the woman press herself up against him and then depart, and he was able to hurry out. Now, I, being of sordid disposition, can imagine him being somewhat overexcited by this encounter and finding it somewhat hard to explain his disarray as he followed himself out, perhaps clutching his prayer book in front of him. But perhaps that's because I am indeed a sordid and wicked boy. Whatever the cause, I have, in all my years of ghost hunting, never once been embraced by an intangible naked lady. In fact, I very rarely get embraced when ghost hunting by naked ladies will stop. I can count the number of times it's anyway. Let's move on from that. So he left the hall and he returned. This is the hall here. There he is, and he returned to his duties as a vicar. And he set about trying to decide what to do. He didn't want to tell Mrs. Cutter that he had encountered a naked lady ghost in her bedroom, the spare bedroom, because he felt that that could be, what's the word? A terrible shock, shall we say. Inappropriate, not entirely the done thing. But he came to the conclusion that he had to tell someone. So you're a vicar who's been embraced by a naked invisible ghost. What do? You phone up the Bishop of Colchester, who's your diocesan bishop, and you say, I say, oh boy, terribly sorry, what? But I seem to have a problem with naked, be intimate. And the bishop says, crikey, come over then. We'd better have a chat about this. I'm interested in spiritualism and all that kind of thing. Do you know what's been going on down at Borley? So Merryweather was treated very reasonably. He was allowed to come along, tell his story, and the bishop said it was fascinating, and he wondered who the ghost was. So the two of them had a quick look through the history of the hall. Now, the hall had been the centre of a large number of tragedies over the years. I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever that Langenhoe has had more than its fair share of tragedy. A number of accidents, one very famous accident with a young chap who shot his girlfriend, though he didn't realise that, or he claims that he never touched the trigger and that the gun wasn't loaded, or at least he didn't know the gun was loaded. I'm sure it was an accident, but, he was found not guilty, but it was terrible. I mean, there have been a number of tragic suicides. There was a fellow who drowned himself in a sluice pipe, who'd been an owner of the hall. Albert Loewenstein, is that how you say it? Do any of you know the story of Albert Loewenstein? He was a financier during the First World War, Belgian, who came to England, and he made an absolute fortune. And after the war, he was accused of being a war profiteer. But his interest in Essex was he brought over a whole load of cattle from Belgium and did his bit to increase the breeding stock of these Belgian cows. And then after the war, Albert took them back and sold them for a great fortune. And he also owned a number of, what's the word I'm looking for? War profitable businesses, shall we say. So he wasn't greatly liked. And around about 1927, he was spending his time between his affairs in Essex and his affairs over in Brussels and in Belgium. I think it was Ostend, actually, he was based there. And one day he had acquired a rather beautiful and massive private aircraft. And remember, this is still 1927, private aircraft, and airliners as we understand them don't exist. And he had a desk and he had a sofa, and his secretary would sit and he would dictate letters. And he had his own personal crew. It was a private aircraft. It contained large enough to fly across, and he used it to commute backwards and forwards from London to Belgium. And one day he got up and he went to the toilet. And the door to the toilet was such that when you were in the toilet, the door opened and the corridor was closed off by it. So it's a two-way door. But for reasons unknown, it is assumed that he opened the outside door and plummeted to his death in the English Channel from the plane. And the weird thing about the story was, although he was facing financial ruin and disgrace, some have said, and he certainly did have major financial issues, I would imagine, his death was entirely unexpected. He seemed to be entirely cheerful. He was smoking a cigar, was going about his usual business. And it seems that the conclusion of the aircraft examiners of the time was that it was an accident. He had got up, gone to the toilet, and rather than turning left and opening the door to the toilet, he had somehow pushed down and pushed against the air pressure and opened the door to the outside and stepped out into nothing, had plunged down several thousand feet. His body was found in the English Channel, so there's no doubt he went out of the aircraft. The problem is that if the plane was at its usual cruising altitude, the pressure on the outside of the plane was lower than the pressure inside, which meant that the door would be held shut by the pressure differential. And it's very hard to wrestle the door open, especially for a fellow like him on heart pills. The whole case makes no sense, but if you're interested, look it up. He lived here. This was his home in the period during the war. So anyway, I mention him because he's one of the other many tragedies associated with Langenhoe, and because his story seems to be largely forgotten now. Let's go back. So I made this rather regal-looking lady. Who could she have been? Well, the Bishop of Colchester got together with old Merryweather. They sat around, had a few brandies, and they researched. And they discovered that the estate, the Langenhoe estate, had been owned by the Waldegrave family. Now, I'm sure you all know by this time that the Waldegraves were recusant Roman Catholics during the reign of Elizabeth I, that they were up to their necks in intelligence efforts on behalf of England, and that they were great patriots in their own way, but they were Roman Catholics at a time when Roman Catholicism was essentially looked at with extreme suspicion, and there were a number of Catholic plots to overthrow the monarch and to have Queen Elizabeth replaced. And it certainly was not a good time for the Waldegraves to be Catholic, but they continued through their loyalty to persist, and they remained one of England's great families right the way through to the 60s, renting out the hall to whoever they wanted. I think they sold the living in the 60s, but anyway, up until that time, the Waldegraves were the obvious candidates, and in round about 1580, 1590, sometime after the Armada, one young lady by the name of Frances Waldegrave, her husband was arrested and was incarcerated briefly in the Tower of London, where sadly, I believe, he died. He died of natural causes in the Tower of London while under suspicion. And the suggestion of these two romantic churchmen of the 1940s was that this lady was the naked lady who had attempted to embrace the Reverend Merryweather, because missing her husband, as you do, and driven mad by lust, the Lady of Langenhoe, I'm so glad I didn't say. Anyway, the Lady of Langenhoe decided that the Reverend Merryweather here was the best option. So, was it Frances Waldegrave? Well, if it was, I would be surprised. Why? Well, you tend to think of ghosts as representing people after their lives, after they've completed living. If she had died at this age, perhaps that's supposed to be her standing in a 50s bedroom. But in fact, some of you may have actually visited her tomb. In fact, I'm going to guess that there's probably more than 10 people here who have visited her tomb. Does anyone know where it is? Please do feel free to speak or message. Does anyone know where that is? Okay, that is the Waldegrave family tomb in Borley Church in Essex. It's the other end of Essex, but it is reasonably well known because, of course, opposite Borley Church,
I'm sure she will be.
Borley Rectory. And the Waldegraves are deeply involved with the history of that parish, which they also owned. So, after his embrace, why do I think that Frances Waldegrave was not the ghostly lady? Well, my major reason for thinking that is simply because she died at the age of 81. And also, she died not in Langenhoe at the Hall. She died in her other house, which still stands today and is still a farmhouse, which stands opposite the site of another well-known building that was called Borley Rectory. Hence the fact her grave is at Borley. So, therefore, the notion that it was Frances Waldegrave struck me as rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Unlikely, shall we say. Anyway, Dear old Herbert Merryweather made his way down to the church and goes about the business of being a clergyman. And from 1937, when he arrived, through to roughly 1947, not very much happened. On one occasion, he had a slight feeling that there was some kind of presence in the church watching him. But otherwise, things seemed quite normal. On another occasion, his faithful housekeeper also went up. She went up to prepare things, probably do the flowers, etc. And she was going about the church when she suddenly had a really strong feeling that she was being watched. And she said she'd been to the church so many times, she went into the vestry and she felt a palpable sense of evil in the vestry. So then she came out of the vestry at considerable speed, gathered up her stuff, went back, told the vicar, and they went back and nothing out of the ordinary. So a short time after that, they went back to the church, and as they went to go in through the vestry door, they discovered that the door wouldn't open. And he turned the key and he struggled with the key, and eventually he became so fed up with it, he went over to the cottage to ask, and he was going to get the chap who lived in the cottage to come over and give him a hand. And the chap from the cottage came over, and the two of them started to wrestle with the door, and they were still trying to work out, well, how are we going to break in? How are we going to get through this? When suddenly the door gave and they went flying, and it opened the first time and he felt like a complete idiot, and the bloke from the cottage shrugged and went back. Merryweather at this point decided, door won't open, feels like someone's holding it from the inside, clearly a ghost. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? I mean, first thing that you think of if your door handle sticks. He's already been grabbed by a naked invisible lady. I mean, why not have a ghost as well at the church? So he struggles with the door on that one occasion and thinks, no, there's more to it than just me being an idiot. He goes into the church, looks around, everything's normal. But he did at this point ask the chap from the cottage, have you ever experienced anything? And the fellow said, no, nothing. There is a story the church is haunted, of course, but I've lived here for, by this time, I think it was about 30 years, 34 years, and he'd never experienced anything. And the other lady who lived across, who was in the other cottage, very willing to accept the fact that it might be haunted, but she hadn't experienced anything at that point. So they had a Pyx lamp, now spelled Pyx, as in kind of pixie, I guess, but no. A Pyx lamp is a lamp that is left burning in a church traditionally overnight, sometimes hanging over the altar. And normally they are rather elaborate little lamps made out of silver and red glass. And you put a candle in, a night light in, and you leave them burning. A sanctuary light, if you will. And I believe there's a story in the Bible about sanctuary lamps and foolish virgins and oil, but I can't remember. I never meet enough foolish virgins, sadly. Still, never mind. This is what he came up with. And this is an artist's rendition. He took a jam jar, he painted it red with enamel paint, a very thin coat thereof, and he used to place a candle in it, or a nightlight, and he would set fire to it and leave it burning in the jam jar, which had holes in the top to ensure there was air, and that was his Pyx lamp. You might think that this is a rather primitive set up for a Church of England church, but we're not, the Roman Catholic Church. And when you've only got 6 parishioners, I think he did quite well to be able to afford a jam jar, don't you? Anyway, probably still hoping for more naked female ghosts to embrace him, he didn't experience any phenomena for some time until he noticed that after 11 years it was of attending the church, suddenly one morning he was doing a service and the light went out. The candle went out. And this began to occur on a regular basis. Now, I don't know about you, but the fact that a candle has blown out in a jam jar does not strike me as a good starter for the next episode of the what's the franchise called? The ones with the people who run around hunting ghosts and demons attack them and phantom nuns and stuff. I've completely forgotten what it's called now. The Conjuring? The Conjuring. The Conjuring 5. The candle blew out. No, it's not a great ghost story, but it was the beginning of a series of phenomena that would go on over the next few years and would grow stronger and stronger. The next thing that happened was that on a Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, they would have sung mass or sung communion, where they would, a very high church approach to doing Holy Communion. And during the Eucharist, while his parishioners, which I think by this point were up to 12 to 20 people maximum, but he's improved the number of people attending, while they were all sitting facing him, he would be at the altar facing them, or with his back to them at the altar serving. But he would turn to address them. And in the Church of England, from Cranmer's time onwards, we have this thing called responses, where the priest says, "May the Lord be with you," and the congregation replies, "And also with you," and so forth. So he has to turn and look back. And while he's performing the holy heart of worship, and everybody is supposed to attend, there would suddenly come a bang. Really loud bang would be heard. And it came from the vestry door. It sounded like the noise you get if you pick up a piece of mud or turf and you lob it at the outside of the door. So obviously they assumed that it was... Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, you went away for a second, but you're back.
Sorry about that. It was the banging. I banged loudly when I heard the when I was talking about. So while he's performing the Mass or the Eucharist, suddenly there's a loud banging noise, which I rather enthusiastically recreated on my table to scare my cat. And he assumes, as does everybody in the church, that it's some local urchin who's come down, is hiding outside, and is lobbing bits of soil at the outside of the building. But no one did anything. They just carried on through the Mass or through the communion, the Eucharist, whichever term you want to use. It's a very high church building, so any of them could be used. After the service, he went out and looked, but the door was undamaged. There was nothing about the door to actually imply that. But he began to feel that there was a sense of palpable eeriness about this building. He really was not sure what he thought of it. And he began to be quite disturbed by going into the church. Up till this point, it had all seemed very normal, but now it had become... The next week, exactly the same thing happened. A few weeks passed without an incident, and then it happened again. And this continued on and off for some weeks. I think there was about 6 or 7 incidents. And on each occasion, exactly the same thing happened. Now, his housekeeper's daughter, who by this time was probably about 30, I think, actually, late 20s, she would get up and sprint outside. So she would abandon worship and slip out as quietly as she could, go out through the other door, and go round to try and find what was going on. Because you would really, wouldn't you? You would try and catch whoever was doing it. But no matter how careful she was, she could never find any evidence of anyone throwing things. Well, what kind of a ghost just goes to the vestry door or the west or one of the doors and hits it? It makes no sense. A few weeks later, a few months later, in fact, he is in the church, and this rather handsome fellow, it's a classical pose from a Renaissance master, I forget which one, of St. George. But there was a little statuette of St. George. Now, there's 2 possibilities with statuettes of St. George. One of them is they look like this fellow does, or the other one is that it's him on the dragon with his lance up in the air, plunging it into the dragon. But St. George was represented by a stone statuette that sat on a table under his red jam jar, his pyx lamp, in other words. And St. George was minding his own business one day, as he always did. One wonders who put George there. Perhaps he'd been there from many vicars' time. Perhaps he was something that had been acquired by Herbert Merriweather. But as the Reverend Merriweather came into the church, he was making his way across the church when he said he suddenly heard a cough. And he turned and looked, and it was as if the statue had coughed. Now, at this point, I think I would be getting up and getting out of there. That would be one ridiculous occurrence too often for me. But then I think back, I don't know if Teaspoon's here tonight, if Jodie's here. Jodie Lofthouse, you and Joe? No idea. But Spoon and I were sitting many years ago up near the Bound in Cheltenham during a ghost investigation when I swore blind that a fox said good evening to me. Now, I'm sure nowadays, logically, that there was, in fact, somebody sitting on the other side of the hedge, standing on the other side of the hedge, who said good evening at the time when the fox opened its mouth to beg for another chip. But whatever the reason, it was quite uncanny, and it caused me to freak out a bit. The notion that a statue might have spoken to you, he immediately rejected. He believed that there was someone standing outside the church, so he went out and looked. And from this point onwards, the phenomena take this form. Increasingly, the doors are hard to open, as if someone's holding them. People say they hear voices from within the church, but nearly all of the witnesses we have are the Reverend Merriweather. Can anyone hear me, by the way? Because it's saying there's a microphone issue.
Yes, that came up, but it's still fine.
We can hear you.
Okay, fine. So I will hope that you can still hear me. Right. Got my wonderful woolly hat back in shot. There you go. Don't want to waste my woolly hat. So one day he has a small number of people, perhaps as many as 20, who've come in, and he's standing at the altar officiating, and he turns probably for a response, so may the Lord be with you and also with you. And as he looks down the church, he sees a young woman. He would estimate her as 20s, possibly 30s. She walked in through the side of the church, and walked up like this. She had a long headdress on, and she walked towards the rear of the church, i.e. the part you enter through, the opposite end of the altar. And as she approached the wall there, she suddenly turned, and she didn't pass out of the door, because he wondered if she was just somebody new to the village who was visiting, or albeit somewhat strangely garbed. But instead, she walked through the wall and disappeared. So she begins naturalistically. She comes in as if she's actually entered through a side door, walks all the way down the church and turns left. Now, the problem is the door she entered through is about halfway down the church, and therefore all of the congregation, being polite, are sitting in the front pews. Now, he said you can't really ask a congregation to turn around and look behind them at the ghost. So he did nothing. He just let the ghost go. So this is a rough recreation, far too grandiose, the height of the building, but it gives you a rough idea of what she looked like as he was staring down. And as she passed to the left, she enters the wall just south of where the bell tower stairs are. So let's go back and have a quick look. Sorry. At, if I can find it, there's quite a few slides back. Langenhoe Church. It is quite a few slides back, isn't it? Fortunately, I should have probably just put it in again, but never mind. So this is not Langenhoe, this is Langenhoe. This is the parish church of St Andrew, not the church of St Mary at Langenhoe. And remember that Langenhoe Church today, or Abberton and Langenhoe Church, is not the same church. That's dedicated like Langenhoe to St Andrew. The one at Langenhoe is no longer there. I'll explain why later on. So he's standing here by the altar. He's looking down, and she comes in, probably from an entrance here, because the north door's locked up, and bricked up, and makes her way down and disappears through the wall here. Now, as I understand it, the tower entrance to the stairs was here. And the argument that follows between him and the bishop and various people, and Peter Underwood poo-pooed him on this, he said that she'd gone through where he believed had previously been the entrance to the church tower, to the stairs that lead you up to the roof. Well, so far, not so hard. Let's go back a bit. The picture I want to show you has got an illustration of the unexplained over the top. So here's the church, and I need to go back one more. If you look at here, you can probably tell that there is no kind of external stair access. Now, what actually changes after the 1883 reconstruction is that there's the building as it was, and this is the building after 1883. And the earthquake damage. Right, I'm going to have to quickly drop out of this, go down, look into that, delete that, and go back to it. There we go. From current slide. Can you see this building, this part here? This is the staircase that was built after 1883 to allow access to the tower roof and the bell loft. That staircase was not there before 1883. If we go back now to the previous one, you will be able to see that clearly there is no staircase. There is no external staircase there. And ditto here. So when they reconstructed it, to actually add more rigidity, one assumes, to the tower and to strengthen it, and so that it would stand after the damage done to the foundations, they adjusted positioning of the stairs, and they built this. It looks like a different building. It isn't. It's exactly the same church, but this tower part is built on. So I think that poor old Herbert Merriweather, despite the fact that Underwood and others laughed at him and said there's no evidence for that, I think he was you can see the staircase there on this 1960 shot. I think he was abundantly right. I think he was completely correct. I think that she went through, the Grey Lady passed through where there was a staircase, but a staircase long before. Now, what time is it, Claire? Can I just ask you?
Yeah, it's you've got 3 minutes to 8, so plenty of time.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, I won't try and I'll just carry on talking. That'll be easier. Right, here we go. So at this point, he's asked a few other friends to get involved, and one of them has taken up a ministry to hop pickers in Hampshire. Now, I'm not sure if ministries to hop pickers in Hampshire still exist, but if they do, I would really love to take one up. And there he got to know a couple of travellers, one of whom he was good friends with. He describes her as a gypsy, but yeah, I would imagine that she was of one of the many different gypsy families of the time. She was doing agricultural labour, and she had travelled all over the country. And she said, oh, my son's joined the British Army. He's going off to Colchester. Now, Colchester is still a barracks town today, so entirely likely that she would say that. And he said, really, I'm going to investigate a haunted church near there. This is the other fellow who I'll get to later, a chap called Denning or Deaning. And she turns around, leans over and says, do you mean Langenhoe Church, sir? Well, I do indeed. That's the very church. Why? Have you heard it's haunted? I have. And she said that when she was a young girl, she was 16 years of age, and her older sister was 17 years old. And they used to camp in the lane going down to the hall, which is a perfectly good and sensible place to form a caravan encampment. And they never used to go down near the church after dark because the villagers claimed that it was haunted by a lady in black who walked around the churchyard at night, trying the doors perhaps. But she was seen at night. And there were, his subsequent inquiries revealed that this is a real piece of folklore from the 19th century, that Langenhoe churchyard was haunted by a ghostly figure. Well, the gypsy lady, and her sister, around about 1910 it would have been. So she would have been born about 1894. She makes her way down one evening because if there's a ghost, they want to see it. And they made their way down, and the two young ladies hid behind a gravestone, no doubt giggling, probably drinking, who knows. But while they were sitting there, everything seemed very normal until suddenly they heard a beautiful singing voice. And as they looked up, they saw a woman walking through the graveyard wearing medieval clothes. And she walked around the church. And they said they had the impression that she had her hair in plaits hanging down her back, that she had some kind of medieval headdress on. And he asked her, was she clad in black? No, sir, it wasn't black. Well, was she clad in white? Oh, no, it was darker than that. Well, was it grey? Could have been grey. It was hard to tell in the moonlight. I couldn't see. But she definitely said she saw the figure. And her and her sister were terribly excited, except her sister didn't see it. Her sister heard the beautiful voice singing a beautiful melody and felt a sensation of sadness and heard the church bell toll or ring a few times, as did she, but her sister swore she did not see the woman at all. So this story is recounted to Denning, and Denning recounts it. I'll call him Denning. I believe he pronounced his name Deaning. I'm trying to think back to my youth in Suffolk and one encounter 40 odd years ago, but we'll go with Denning because that's what other people call him. I'm sure his family will correct me at some point. Okay. So soon after that, Denning has been talking to people, and he comes across a young fellow who I think would have been about 22 at the time, by the name of Peter Underwood. And Peter Underwood is terribly enthusiastic about ghosts and ghoulies and stuff. So the two of them set off and they made their way to the church, acquired the key from the vicar, and they decided they were going to do what today we would call champing. Now, did any of you see the Inside Number 9 episode? Actually, is Reese here tonight? I think he was earlier. Don't know if he still is, but there was a wonderful Inside Number 9, Christmas before last, I think it was, where they go champing at a church. You should watch it if you haven't, but it's got that kind of vibe because the two of them turn up, they borrow the keys, they go into the church, they wrap themselves up with some blankets, probably have a few coffees, and start to wait. And while they're waiting, suddenly the roof starts to rattle. And it's torrential rain, and there was a blast of lightning, and the wind howled round, and the whole night the building is buffeted by this tremendous storm. Now, later in his life, Peter Underwood would say that he had experienced singing that night, and that he had heard snatches of noises, but it was all maddeningly elusive. And in one of the Fortean Times, there's a discussion in which how Peter elaborates the story over his successive books is mentioned, because he starts off, but Denning's account is quite frank. He said, we stayed there all night. We sat in the dark. It was incredibly spooky and atmospheric. The building was, rattling away, but we saw and heard nothing, despite all expectation. Perfect conditions, really, for a ghostly. Nothing happened. And another fellow who spent a night in a church, who was by the name of James Wentworth Day, we'll mention him later, also experienced nothing. Still, Herbert Merriweather had by this time begun to attract quite a lot of attention. And the story's getting more and more complicated. And this is the point where I'm going to try and introduce some of the players. And I'm not going to go into too much detail tonight because I'm going to do part 2 on this, I think, because otherwise it's going to be far too long. But do any of you recognise the Bull sisters and this charming house? Because in many ways, this is where our story begins. Do you know where this is?
Bawley Rectory.
It is indeed Bawley Rectory. And it was at Bawley Rectory that a young man by the name of Denning was ghost hunting in the period after the war. It's between 24 miles and 22 miles by road. I'd guess it's about 20 miles straight across the fields, if that was possible. It's about a day's journey on horseback, or a day and a half. You could do it in a day if you rode the horse quite hard. But it was, they're not close to one another. But the relationship between Borley and Langenhoe is that they were both owned by the same family, the Waldegraves. And because the Waldegraves owned both parishes, they had the right to appoint the vicars, or the rectors later, but, the vicars were the people they appointed. And the vicars of Borley and the vicars of Langenhoe were often the same chap. And they would then find somebody else to actually, officiate on their behalf while they were away. So Langenhoe and Borley in the 17th century had the same vicar. And there were, all the way through history, there have been many connections between the two parishes. This was a connection of a very different type, though. In the period after the burning down of Borley Rectory, Alfred C. Henning became the first new vicar of Borley and Lister. Years later, Edward Babs would add Cavendish to the collection, I believe. Or was it? No, it was Claudine Matthias's husband, the Reverend Matthias, would add it. Babs was the writer, Matthias was the vicar. Sorry, I'm trying to get these things right. So Henning, the vicar of Borley, was rather interested in ghost hunting. And he had got the bug after he got to know a young fellow called Harry Price, who used to poke around in the ruins. And he'd paid quite a lot of attention. And Henning was also a Essex clergyman in the Diocese of Colchester. And he was told some stories while he was talking to the bishop about his time at Borley and what was happening there. He was told that similar things were happening down on the coast at Langenhoe. And he was, at that time, writing a little book called Haunted Borley. That's my copy. I don't know how many of you have actually ever read Haunted Borley, but it is a very well-written book. I think it's quite hard to get hold of nowadays. It wasn't when I was young. Well, it was, but it wasn't ridiculously expensive like it is now. But almost certainly we should make it available somehow if it's out of copyright. Anyway, let's move on. So Alfred Henning, he was, well, just a bit of proof here he was interested. Mrs. N.A. Walrond, who writes novels under the name of Nora Burke, Bury St Edmunds produced 3 ladies who were very famous novelists under pseudonyms, all of whom's novels are largely forgotten now because they're what we would call chick lit or romance novels. But each of them had some influence. But anyway, Nora Burke claimed to hear ghostly music while walking towards the church with the Reverend A.C. Henning. We were walking towards the south door of the church, she said, when I heard the organ playing. It sounded as though a service was in progress. Mr. Henning, of course, knew there was no service. He stopped and also heard the music. We hurried to the church, but found it empty and the music had stopped. So that was I think that's probably the first reference to the church being haunted after the end of Borley Rectory. That's 1947. I think it was May 47. But there you go. Anyway, he discovered a young fellow who used to go down and camp in the grounds at Borley, and they became friends. And the Reverend John C. Denning had taken this up after he was demobbed from the British Army in 1945. And Denning, or Deaning, as I think some people, as I think his name may have been pronounced by him, but we'll call him Denning as everyone does. Denning went on to write a wonderful book called The Restless Spirits of Langenhoe. Now, if you Google his name, you should be able to find this book. If you buy it from his family, there's an email address to get hold of it. You'll probably find it much cheaper than if you try and buy a copy on the second-hand market. He also wrote From Darkness to Light, Traumatic Encounters with Earthbound Spirits, which I've still not read, but which I will, and a book about Richard III and the Princes. And the Reverend Denning became the chronicler of the events of Langenhoe. So he meets the Reverend Alfred Henning. who says, I like to think that our west window has all the exuberance of Chaucer, but none of the concomitant vulgarities. Oh, sorry, that was Kind Hearts and Coronets. He meets Henning at Borley, and he sets about talking ghosts. They start ghost hunting together, and they get in touch with another fellow called James Turner. Now, Turner is a rather mysterious fellow in some ways. Not in his life. He was a well-known novelist and writer and poet, and his great passion were cats and gardening. I get the impression sometimes winding people up. And his book, My Life with Borley Rectory, was published in 1950 and is largely a comic story about how he took over the grounds and the gardens and built his own house. There's a slightly more serious look at his life there in his autobiographical novel, Sometimes into England. And he wrote a couple of autobiographies, but that one deals with the period after the war. Now, remember I started off by saying there's something terribly English about ghost stories. And there's something sort of comforting. It's really comforting to think that one day we may wander the lanes and we may wander around and we may persist when our mortal shells have gone and I no longer am the size of a beached whale. Perhaps my spirit will walk and flit round Normal Terrace playing with cats. Perhaps I will spend my time as a poltergeist persecuting people who annoyed me and disrupting their gardens and chasing their cats. Well, probably not, probably just petting their cats. But one of the things about all these fellows, Turner, Henning, Denning, is they're representatives of a certain kind of old Englishness, I suppose, a kind of middle-class white Britishness that has long fallen into the past. And we feel a nostalgia for these chaps. I think the term chaps is what I would use. And sometimes when I think about the Ghost Club and Underwood particularly, that's what I think of. I think of a slightly chappish kind of Middle English eccentricity of the 20th century. I mean, my own notion of nostalgia, I suppose, would be more Morecambe and Wise and 1970s sitcoms like George and Mildred. And, you know, it's the England of my youth. And perhaps this was the England of other people's youths. But so James Turner, anyway, becomes part of the ghost hunting trio. And they set off to Langenhoe. And they, over the next few years, spend a great deal of time there. And there's an interesting story, which I love, which is that Borley Rectory, after it was destroyed, after it burnt down after the Greg's fire, before it was finally demolished, so in the late 40s, was haunted by a large black cat. And there is, in fact, a story that's told by Turner about how Denning encountered a spectral cat at his house in the grounds. And another fellow who we're going to get to in a moment, Wentworth Day, has a part in one of his books where he talks about encountering in the ruins of Borley Rectory a massive black cat, a spooky beast that went past him into the ruins and did not come out again. It runs up the staircase and waits at the top. Now, I have a problem because I own cats, but my problem is twofold. Firstly, the Bulls own 20 plus cats. I think they had over 30 cats at the most, and there's a cat's graveyard there. And it's hardly unsurprising if the area around Borley was somewhat overrun by their offspring. It would not surprise me at all if there were stray and feral cats in the vicinity. Wentworth Day said that he went round and asked everybody, had they seen any cats? You know, did they own a black cat? And they all said, oh, we don't have any black cats, no. But I think that, and the other thing is that Turner and his wife Catherine, James and Catherine Turner, they absolutely adored cats, and their books are filled with the stories of their cats. And I strongly suspect that the ghostly cats were him teasing the others, but who knows? Then we come across James Wentworth Day. Now, James Wentworth Day achieved a remarkable feat in my life because I've always been really fond of ghost stories. I'm deeply passionate about East Anglian history. I grew up on a farm and I grew up on a rural East Anglian estate. And as it happens, he also wrote books on all those topics, even on cats. And James Wentworth Day wrote quite a lot about the royal shoot that took place at the house I grew up in, Lodge Farm, Ingham, Colford Lodge, as it was sometimes called. They stayed there and went shooting Edward the VIII when he was Prince of Wales, and then various other royals lived there at various points, stayed there at various points while they shot vast numbers of pheasants. Anyway, because of that, I read some Wentworth Day. But I finally tried to read a Ghost Hunter's game book. I think it's that one where he deals with his experiences at Langenhoe Church. And I couldn't read it. And I've read it, I've tried several times, and each time I find that firstly, he's a journalist and he writes in a very superficial manner. Secondly, no matter how much he's trying to be serious, because he couches things in such dramatic tones, it's very artistically overwritten. But mainly, I got the idea that he was some kind of crypto-fascist. It's all about, well, then I stayed at Lady So-and-so's house, and the Earl of what's-his-name and the wonderful Duke of wherever, well, they were sitting playing cards, and you don't get gentlemen like that anymore, but they invited me to join them because they recognized me as being a noble kind of fellow, and well, we sat around and then we went out and blasted a whole load of pheasants, wahoo. And he just came over as being, I don't know, sycophantic. I have met titled aristocrats. I may know some quite well, but I've never found any of those types remotely like his depiction of them. He just seems to be desperately trying to fit in. So Wentworth Day, born in 1899, died in 1983. I looked him up. I didn't know much about him, but he's the other figure in this story, and he doesn't fit comfortably with it. And Underwood and the others don't really mention him. Denning, so far, I don't think he mentions Wentworth Day much, and there might be a reason. In 1958, after a lengthy career during which he had avoided the war by being a journalist and riding around East Anglia, writing books on East Anglia, and spent a lot of his time telling posh people how wonderful they were and attending shooting parties at country houses and killing anything he possibly could. He was invited by a young journalist called Daniel Farson to take part in a series of TV broadcasts. And he was deliberately chosen as the most reactionary high Tory bigot they could find, I believe. And I will warn you now that if you look him up, you will discover some of the most nauseating, racist, abominable, horrific nonsense you will ever listen to. His appearances on these TV shows were one of, eventually, they stopped from producing them because Farson, as it happened, was gay, and he'd been asked to do an episode which was entitled Transvesticism, and it began with Wentworth Day, the ghost hunter, declaring, or journalist, author, many other things, declaring out loud, well, the gallows, we should have them all hanged. There's no place for people who dress up as women unless they're women, and there's no place for homosexuals in our society. It's against the law, which it was then for another 12 years, and they should all be hanged. No sympathy, they're not sick, they're criminal, they deserve the gallows. He also held roughly similar attitudes, though he felt possibly mental hospitals should be offered first, for people who engaged in mixed-race marriages. And the reaction was, in 1957, that he was an incredible racist, unpleasant bigot. And much was made of the fact that while he was an assistant to Lady Houston and working on her estates, he had been a sycophantic toady to Mussolini and had rather sung the praises of Italian fascism. So there you go, J. Wentworth Day. And you can find his books. I recommend you download them from somewhere or buy them secondhand, though I'm sure his family are lovely people, so they probably don't deserve for you to not buy them. But I was quite shocked. Read the Wikipedia entry if you want to know more. Finally, Peter Underwood. Underwood was a curmudgeon, actually, by the time I met him, but he was an incredibly dedicated, his whole life was dedicated to the pursuit of hauntings, and he was deeply involved with Langenhoe. But he only visits on a handful of occasions, or 2 or 3 occasions, I believe, and spends the night. But he was certainly up to date and part of the circle. Now, have you noticed something about these people? There's Peter. They were, oh, and finally, Peter Haining. They didn't like Peter. He was a pleb. He was a slightly leftist, I think they suspected, journalist. I don't think he was. And they saw him as part of the kind of 1960s psychedelic generation. And he was excluded from the ghost hunting. But he was actually one of the people who chronicled the events at Langenhoe most passionately. There's Peter. He died suddenly at a very young age, 67, I think. Died of heart failure, but I think that's a wonderful photo of him. And again, I did meet Peter. So finally, oh, well, we'll come to this another time. But Langenhoe has also, there's Langenhoe Hall. This is from the Unexplained 45, so this would be about 1982, 1983. But this is a 1960s experience that involved UFOs flying over the hall and the remains of where the church was. So, what's going on at Langenhoe? Well, I've only got about halfway through the story. I've introduced most of the players, and I will be telling the story of the UFO as well. We'll discuss whether or not that's relevant. But I think I've probably talked long enough today. What I'd like to say is that Underwood with Denning came up with, and with the others, with Henning and with, the whole bunch of them apart from Haining, they came up with their own ideas about what was going on. And Denning became quite convinced that the way forward was to hold seances, but they also performed historical research. Now, what I haven't got into so far is how the haunting develops into the second and more frightening phase. But the thing that I think we're already seeing is that almost everything that's happened has happened to Merriweather. Ernest Merriweather. I call him Herbert for some reason. Never mind. Anyway, I can't always get things right when I'm talking off the top of my head at short notice. Merriweather, the Reverend Merriweather, had discovered, though, that there was a leak up in the tower roof, I believe, or there was some minor repair that needed doing. Now, it happened that years before, there was a fellow who used to attend the church. He wasn't still coming, but he was a builder. So he went and asked him if he would be so good as to take a look and do the repairs that were necessary. And the chap agreed, a fee was fixed, and he went off to work on it. And as the builder came to the church, he had a horrible feeling. He didn't know why. He'd been in the church many times. This was his home. He was from the village. He took his key out and tried to enter with the key, and it kept jamming. Eventually, he got into the church. It released itself, as these things do, made his way back, and took his ladder out, set it up, starts to work on the repairs. And as he did so, he became quite unnerved. He'd heard noises. He thought he heard a snatch of singing coming from somewhere within, a woman singing in a beautiful voice. He comes down, and as he puts his foot down on the floor, a snake came out of the long grass and entwined itself around the foot of his ladder. And that was the last straw. He didn't think the snake was anything to do with the ghost, but he was sure he was encountering a haunting. So he turned and he ran as fast as he could, and he fled. Shortly after this, Henning himself hears the woman singing in the church. Now, before this, he's heard one voice, and he had been in the church one day. He'd been approaching the altar when his penknife in his pocket, he didn't realize, was taken out. The blade was opened and it was laid on the floor pointing towards him. And he heard a woman's voice say, "You are so cruel," presumably because he was carrying a knife. Now he was alone in the church. He turned round and there was the knife, open, pointed at him. There was no woman. But on this occasion, he hears a woman singing. He couldn't make out the words. He thought originally it was Latin, but then he decided it was French. But whichever language he was singing in, he felt that it was a beautiful melody. Everything seemed to agree that it was a woman up until this point. I'm going to end part one with two builders he's hired, or two labourers he hired to do work, who also heard the woman singing. But annoyingly, when Denning and the others try and catch up with them and demand to speak to them, because they had come to the suspicion that maybe Merryweather had imagined the singing after hearing the story from the gypsy pot picker. So therefore, that it wasn't entirely reliable. Well, unfortunately, tragically, they could not find the two witnesses. They were casual labourers. They had left the farm. That really surprises me, because if I was a farmer, I grew up on a farm in East Anglia, if we'd hired casual labourers to do a job, we would know their names. You know, the Stennets would know who they were. The Brahms would know who they were. Everyone would be introduced by somebody. Even if you were just doing a casual job, you would almost always be someone who, the only exception was one day when some lads met my father in a car park and said they were tarmacking roads, and they had a lorry load of tarmac left over and that they'd do his drive for 100 quid. And he said, deal. And they seemed really shocked, but they agreed to do it. So they came to do his drive for 100 quid and then discovered that it was, well, 3/4 of a mile down to the house one side, and the other side of the drive was a mile straight down the other side. And he said, go on then. And they told him where to go and drove off at great speed. But never mind. Apart from my father being an arse, usually we would know the names. So can we rely on Merryweather as a witness? Well, John Denning believed we could. And so in part two of this story, if anyone's interested, we will try and unravel the mystery of what really happened at Langenhoe and if it's still haunted today. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there because otherwise I'm just going to go on too long.